This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay. Now, what I'm talking about today is what was in the 19th century called the portable building, which is what we would call prefabricated. I'm not going to give you a world history of prefabrication because I do that in another subject in the faculty. But Australia has a large number of these buildings, and we are now putting them up for World Heritage listing because there are more in Australia than anywhere else in the world. So I'm really talking about buildings in Australia for the moment. I'm here now looking at the first European building in Australia, which is a prefabricated structure. And I want to ask you, what is it made of? Some brave person. First European building in Australia, built for Governor Phillip at Sydney. What's it made of? Come on now.
I guess it's concrete or timber.
Some sort of what?
Like concrete or stone?
It looks like concrete or stone, except you're looking at the wrong building. The first building in Australia was that one on the side there. This was bought by Governor Phillip when he came. It's a canvas house built on a timber frame, so-called canvas house, in fact made of oilcloth. Now, oilcloth is the material which is used, say, for flooring before linoleum, also lightweight version for covering furniture. It's a fabric which has been impregnated with waxes and resins and so on to make it water resistant and durable. So this was made, it was on a patent system by Nathan Smith of London, who made this house. That's the first European building put up in Australia. He then built, of course, his two-story house next door to it. Just on another topic before I leave this picture, that building has a pointy thing at the top. What's that? What's rising out of the roof? Is it that Governor Phillip was trying to get Sky Channel on his TV?
Is it just a flagpole?
What?
Flagpole?
No, it's not. See, tapers. It's generally thought to be a lightning conductor. And it's very interesting because the lightning conductor wasn't known in Australia. It was invented in the mid-18th century by Benjamin Franklin in America and by a Polish priest around about the same time, around about 1750. But it was not in wide use in Australia until powder magazines and flammable structures began to be built. So it looks as though some member of the Royal Society in England, which was supporting this trip by Phillip, said to him, "You're going to build the highest building in Australia for the first time. You're in danger of lightning. You better try this new scientific device to protect it." We know nothing about how that happened, but that seems to be what must have occurred. Anyway, turning back to that building, here it is close up. You see it's built in square panels with the fabric stretched across them. And the only surviving building of this material is this one here, which was built as a garden tent and now is preserved in England, as in the bottom view, in a Chinese style. So a non-functional building, but in fact made of the same oilcloth material as our first Australian building. There were lots of others built at the time, especially in places like Sierra Leone. Houses and hospitals and so on were built in this oilcloth at the time. Detail of that tent. Now turning to people who made buildings in timber. Peter Thomson is a strange, eccentric London builder. At one stage he was convicted of art forgery, so he has a rather checkered career. And he made houses for South Australia in the 1830s. Perhaps I should explain to you that the main motivation for prefabrication tends to be labour costs. So when labour is expensive in, say, a colony, it's worth making the building back at home and sending it out. So in the case of New South Wales, after that first house of Governor Phillip, there was hardly any need for prefabrication because labour was incredibly cheap because you had totally free convict labour. So prefabrication for New South Wales stops. But new colonies like Adelaide have a need for it. So Peter Thomson in London is making these houses for immigrants to Adelaide. He also made much more elaborate houses for more important people. This one is in New Zealand. You can see it's a complicated building. You see the little sketch plan at the bottom. A whole string of large rooms with a wide passage linking behind. And just bear that in mind because this house here in Victoria is the same. You've got to ignore that granite column portico on the front or veranda along the front. Behind that is a very similar house to the New Zealand house made by Peter Thomson of London. there, those views here, it's been hard to make out, but you're seeing the bottom model is the way it is today. The top behind it, top of the screen, is the original house. And it has in it, it's a timber structure, but has in it those iron window sashes on the left. On the right, you can see the timber ceiling, which is panels which drop in, so the rectangular grid structure and panels that drop into place to make his prefabrication system. Another contemporary person was Henry Manning of London, and perhaps a more important person. Manning began by making a house for his son who was immigrating to Perth in Western Australia, and got the idea that there's a market, perhaps, that he could make these buildings for other people as well. He made small cottages, but also made large buildings like this one, the first government house in New Zealand, which was put up by the colonial architect William Mason in 1841. Then he advertised these cottages. Here's his advertisement on the most simple and approved principles. And these were designed to be used in England for, say, portable buildings for people who go hunting and so on, but also as cottages for export to Australia and elsewhere, particularly, in fact, again, to Adelaide. This is an advertisement from the South Australian Record, so pitched at the Adelaide market. And this is his simple system for cottages. So he built the big buildings like the government house in Auckland in perhaps a more conventional way, but this was a system where you have standard forms of column. You can see at the bottom right-hand side the 3-grooved column. You get a 3-groove, 2-groove, or 4-groove, whatever it is. So you could slot into it a panel for a solid wall, a panel for a window or a door frame into the same sort of column. So rather than having to go to Manning and order your house, have it made up for you, you could go to Manning and buy 20 solid panels, 60 columns, 30 beams and so on, and make up almost your own design. This is a revolutionary concept, industrialized building system. So you can see at the top right-hand side, fitting into the frame, the door and the solid panel and so on. And the Trobes Cottage in Melbourne was built on that system. It's a bit misleading, however, because the Trobes Cottage, as it's, I don't know if you've been to see that site, it's outside Botanic Gardens off Domain Road, but the cottage is the right-hand part of this diagram here. When it was put up in Melbourne, this was built onto the end of it as a dining room. So the local builder who put the cottage up built a conventional structure on the end, and shortly afterwards the outbuildings at the back were built. So we have this rather messed up Manning building, and when it survived for a long time in East Melbourne and was finally moved to the present site, by the time it was moved, all that survived of the original cottage was the part circled in yellow, the end of the building where it joined the dining room. So what we have today is built in the domain outside Botanic Gardens is the end of a Manning building, and the rest is totally fake. But it's still worth looking at. It's an interesting example. In South Australia, more complete examples survive. This one is a Manning cottage at Burnside. You can see that same panel system exactly. There you see it internally. And a rather old system, because it's not Manning's ordinary system, but it's a prefabricated building of great interest, is the Quaker Meeting House or Friends Meeting House in North Adelaide. Different sort of elements inside it, but still totally prefabricated. And internally, even the furniture was prefabricated, and that survives today. It's the only example of prefabricated furniture of this era surviving. Now in Melbourne, the big change was with the gold rushes, because there's a huge influx of migrants with the gold rushes and a huge demand for buildings, which couldn't be satisfied by the local building industry. All the local builders, of course, ran off to the goldfields straight away, and building just really stopped in Melbourne for at least a year. And here, looking on the wharf at Port Melbourne, where in the background, back left, you see a building with George F. Train and Company written onto it. And George F. Train was a merchant from Boston, and he was one of the people who imported buildings from North America. In the foreground, you see the Chinese. A lot of Chinese came to the gold rushes, and we imported buildings from Hong Kong and from Singapore as well. And this is trying to make a point about our location. Marked there are all the overseas places which made prefabricated buildings. And if you think about how you get them to Australia, it's quite complicated, because all the European ports and Boston, New York on the east side of North America, there's no way to get to Melbourne without going right down around Cape Horn, at the bottom end of South America. Very difficult and complicated trip. Or you could go to the Panama Isthmus, the little neck in the middle of America, which had no canal at that time. So you could take your goods there, you could unship them, take them by cart overland and put them on a ship on the other side. Even to get to California, you have to do the same thing, much less Australia. So, just a moment. So obviously Hong Kong and Singapore were much more accessible to places like Melbourne and Adelaide. So Hong Kong, Singapore houses came in quite large numbers. And here's an example first of one of those that came from North America, from Boston. The building in the view, you can hardly see any of the original building at all, but the bottom view is the building being taken apart, and I photographed it while it was coming apart and found these details in it. See, the top piece of timber has TS & Co on it. I don't know what TS & Co is, but the middle one has CT & Co, which is Caldwell Train & Company, and that's the man, George Train, whose warehouse we saw before. Caldwell Train & Company had a branch in Boston. They sent their buildings out to the Melbourne branch to sell. And then the bottom timber has ABPL, which is the name of a ship. This would have been the ship on which this was sent to Melbourne. And those components, which we saw on the ground there, are now in storage. They've been held ever since in an attic in Geelong, and with luck might get put up again one day in the future. Interesting structural detail here is the building contained these long strap bolts, was braced and held together by these straps which end up with a threaded bolt end to it. And exactly the same bolt has been found in a house in Williamstown, presumably from the same maker. Here now is another American building. This for a long time was thought to be an Irish building, but it's not. It's in North Melbourne, in Victoria Street. And I perhaps want to explain to you that Victoria Street was the boundary of central Melbourne, and the Melbourne Building Act, which stopped you building wooden buildings, applied to the south side of the street, not to the north side. So on the north side of Victoria Street, you could build wooden buildings. On the south side, you couldn't. This building here has a porch inspired by this American form of porch. You see the design by Andrew Jackson Downing here, compared with the porch on our North Melbourne building. That was the first clue that it's American. Since then, the timbers have been analysed. We know there to be American timbers. There's a view of the building that was in use as a school. This next one now is a London-made building. It was put up in Brunswick in 1856. A quarry was built on the site, so they had to move the building. In the 1870s, it was moved to its present site, which is in Coburg, or Pascoe Vale. And there it is today, as now restored. It has interesting technical details. You see the boarding, it's not overlapping weatherboarding. It's what in Queensland you might call chamfer board or shiplap boarding, except that when you come in close to it, the recesses are not, it's not a recessed timber piece, it's an iron spline. The pieces are joined, they have grooves in them, and a flat bar of iron joins the timbers together. So you get this wide spline, so there's an exposed face, which is painted, and then a shallow part joining to each piece of timber. On the ground there, you're seeing the wide pieces of iron, are those splines, they're the board at the top of the groove into which it goes. The narrow pieces are spanning floorboards. So in floorboards, you don't have any exposed face, so that narrow piece just joins two boards together. So the whole structure uses these iron splines to join it together. Now going back to the map again, there's what happens first with the California gold rush. Hong Kong and Singapore send buildings to California before they can get there from, say, the east part of the United States. And then when the gold rush occurs in Australia, of course, they can easily supply them to Victoria. In the meantime, all these other locations there are biding their time until the use of iron particularly makes them viable sources of export to Australia. But the Singapore cottages we have in Melbourne were like this. Here's one of them. This was built off Hoddle Street, East Melbourne. So it came from Singapore in parts. It was put up in East Melbourne at a time when East Melbourne, the land had just been sold, so most of it was undeveloped. And that circle is showing the site of this house near the corner of Hoddle Street and Wellington Parade. And it stood there until, again, a railway line was built through. The Collingwood railway line cuts through there. There's a sort of underground cutting you can see there if you go there today. And the house had to be moved. It was moved to Mentone. There it is in Mentone. Someone has built onto it a later veranda. You see the roof of it is, what's that roof made of? They're actually sheet iron tiles, flat iron tiles, which probably would have been bought in Melbourne and put on the roof. The building would have been supplied probably with either a boarded roof or a canvas or oilcloth roof. But many of these cottages have these iron tiles, which were common in the 1850s. Here you see the same building a little later. You can see the iron tiles more clearly. Somebody's made it more fashionable by putting a Californian bungalow porch onto it. And then you see it being demolished in 1983 when Mentone Grammar, which now owned the property, required the space. So it's been taken apart. It was taken apart and put into storage. Here you see the weatherboards on the left-hand side. They're quirked. They've had that hand-run curved moulding on them. On the right, one of the rooms, they're strange long-shaped rooms, and the timbers have markings on them. Again, which has to do with the marking for consignment. That is, marking the timbers so you knew which batch belonged to which house when you came to put them up. And that's the system that was used in this building. So although it's not an industrialized system, perhaps in the Manning sense, it is largely a modularized system. And there it is, reassembled on the site in Collingwood. Now, when you look at this closely, you find it has interesting details. Like there, you see Chinese symbols. Now, you might think those Chinese symbols say, there's the lower orange arrows, put tab A into slot B, but they don't. They say things like B and flower and heaven and so on, and they're really designed to indicate a joint, identify a joint rather than give actual instructions for assemblage. Also at the top, you might see those little white holes through the posts. What purpose do they serve? What do they indicate? Why would you have rectangular holes mortised through your posts? Any ideas? Well, it's because they would have had a beam or a series of beams like that in them. All that indicates is that they were using traditional Malay masonry tradition, Malay carpentry traditions in building this house. There's no real structural purpose in that beam. I think if anything, it's designed to hold the structure together while you complete the roof. But it was copied in this structure. So you have Chinese characters and Malay carpentry and a design which is made up really for the English market with conventional English-sized rooms and so on. It's a very interesting cultural hybrid you get resulting from it. There you see a plan with all the different Chinese characters and their interpretations on them. And the jointing here, which is claimed to be Chinese jointing, although much of it is in fact the same as European jointing. And here's another of these houses. Again, look at the outside. You have no idea it was a Singapore house at all. It's got a bungalow porch and so on. Only when you go in close to it, you find that at the bottom front corner, the beam is crossed at the corner. So there's big rectangular, almost square balks of timber, which is based, and they are halved into each other at the corners. Mostly that detail disappears because they rot at the corners, they get sawn off, and you don't see it. But originally these buildings often had the cross beams at the bottom and at the top, the ceiling height, which are an indication. Where the weatherboards come off there, you can see vertical boarding, which is the lining of this building. And there, the cross corners are a Malay tradition, once again. Now you see in that same building, they've cut through the roof, taken a sheet of iron off, the shingle roof, and this group of people are going in illegally into this house because the owners don't know anything about this, and they include me. That in the foreground is Andrew Muir, who was the man who collected the previous house, rebuilt it at Collingwood, and two others of us go through the roof into this roof space illegally. And there's one of them with his Keeble architect in the roof. Now looking there, you can see again the mortise holes through the posts, which indicate not one continuous post, but a series of linking beams in between, reflecting that traditional Malay element. And here's that house now rebuilt on the site in Collingwood. Now, these survive nowhere else in the world, and nobody in Singapore knows anything about them either. So they're really of enormous interest. And there are a couple of others as well, which I'm not going to show you. More surprising, perhaps, is this papier-mâché, mashed up paper being used for houses. None of these survive, but they were, in fact, quite prominent in their time. Here's a papier-mâché church made by a man called Bielefeld outside London. It has timber framing, but the panels are all papier-mâché. What happened with Bielefeld is that he originally made papier-mâché ornaments which are used instead of plaster around, say, around the ceilings of rooms or centre flowers in the centre of the ceiling. He was commissioned to design the walls for steamship cabins. Steamships, of course, the big new luxury transport of the time. They got their best elements. They made ornamental panels to divide the cabins one from another. And they were timber framed with papier-mâché on them. And this man, Bielefeld, thought, well, if I can make a panel wall, why not make a complete building, which he did. He took out a patent for a supposed waterproof version of papier-mâché with chemicals which made it waterproof and made complete buildings. This is a large villa to be sent to Melbourne. A man called Seymour emigrated to Melbourne with his villa and a number of smaller houses, a complete village made in papier-mâché. There's the interior view of it. You might note again the ceiling is panelled, rather like the timber panelled ceiling we saw before in the Thompson house. There's the smallest model house. And there's the whole village, as envisaged before it was sent out to Australia. It actually got built, apparently, or partly built in Coburg. There's a lawsuit and sort of dismantled, and nothing survives today. There's no papier-mâché building surviving in the world today that we know of. But that's the same villa on the left-hand view. Here's the sale notice when it was put up for sale in 1855. Now, I'm turning to iron. Edward Taylor Bell House was a millwright in Manchester. And when the gold rush broke out in California, which was just before the Australian ones, about 1848 to 9, there was a demand for iron buildings. Not that people wanted iron houses, but more that English merchants going to California wanted to take out a warehouse with them which would be secure, so that when they got there, they'd have somewhere to lock their goods up, somewhere to live. So the first buildings that go out are iron buildings with living quarters over a ground floor warehouse. And Bell House makes those for English merchants who are going to the scene. And he develops over time what began with a sheet iron and then the corrugated iron wall, a patent system where the columns are shaped to fit the corrugation to the iron. It's a bit hard to make this out here. You're seeing the corrugations on the left in that elevation, but on the right, that circular corner column has a flange coming out, which is, you can see this diagram, but it actually turns out an L shape. If you can see where it says F, which is cut to fit the corrugation. So it's sinuous cutting there, and the corrugation slot into that flange. And you can make a complete building in which all the iron columns are shaped to fit the corrugations, and so is the cast iron gutter on the edge of the roof, even the cast iron cresting on top of the roof. And this was so interesting when it was shown in the Great Exhibition in London. You know about the Crystal Palace. That's when the exhibition occurred. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, saw these buildings and ordered one for Balmoral Castle in Scotland as a ballroom. So this is the design resulting from the use of Bell House's patent iron system to build a ballroom for Queen Victoria and Prince Albert at Balmoral. And it survives today. There it is today, now used as a joinery workshop. Some details of the corner columns. Only one other building by Bell House survives today. It's this building here, which was put up as a cottage in Fitzroy, and later on moved by the National Trust to South Melbourne. The veranda is not part of the system, the veranda was just built on. The window at the top left is part of the system. It's a cast iron window in which 4 panes in the middle pivot, separate from the rest. That was a standard cotton milling detail in Manchester. So Bell House, who was a cotton milling engineer, transfers these standard cotton mill details into the buildings he makes for export to Australia. There it is, that was put up by the National Trust in South Melbourne. And he also made this theatre, a complete theatre, which stood in Exhibition Street, the Royal Olympic Theatre. Although the facade parts are all largely glazed, the structure behind is that conventional bell house patent system. Now, locally, the government needed to get housing for its employees, and they toyed with the idea of getting housing in from Hong Kong for a time. But in the end, the colonial architect Henry Ginn ordered iron buildings from London, and he did a design which seemed to have been used, seemed to be designed in Victoria, and then tenderers conformed to it. And this house here to the west of Geelong is one of these buildings. It consists of T-shaped, an angle-shaped wrought iron framing with corrugated iron panels in between, and it's all galvanized, so it survived even to the present day, virtually without rusting, because it was very high-grade galvanizing, except some of the components that join together, some of the straps and angles that join together, which are wrought iron, have rusted. Now, this came out with components labelled, and I'll show you the drawing in a moment, and it was assembled by the use of gussets. See the gussets at the bottom left? So two rectangular panels are connected by that flaring gusset shape. And there's the maker's plate on the end, partly obscure, but it's John Walker of London, Millwall Poplar, London. And what's surprising is that other buildings come of exactly the same form by a different maker. So that really proves that the design was prepared in Victoria and the tenderers had to conform to the design. See that number you can see on the corner angle, 60A, that conforms to the system shown on the drawings. Actually, one digit different, but there's the drawing supplied with this building, showing the two elevations combined, the long and end elevation, with the numbers on them to tell you how to assemble the building together. You can see the gusset connections clearly. Here now is that same gusset, and a building with a different maker's name on it. And here's this building here, which is not very far from us in Parkville, off Royal Parade, Parkville, put up as a ranger's house in the Royal Park in the 1850s and survives today. Then, by contrast, there are, apart from those corrugated iron simple buildings, quite elaborate ones. First of all, here we're looking at some simple buildings. These are cottages in South Melbourne. A whole village, about 20 of these buildings were built by one person, Robert Patterson, who imported these little two-room cottages and some big four-room cottages which go on the main streets all at once and made this complete sort of iron settlement in South Melbourne. Now, these are made of wrought iron, again, angles and T-shapes with corrugated iron in between. It's heavy, very heavy gauge corrugated iron this time, much broader corrugations and much thicker. They have a little attic space on the roof, you reach by a ladder. The windows are cast iron, very elegant cast iron windows with curved heads. And there's one of them before it's demolished. You can see at the top right, the window into the attic. And here's the larger model, the four-room model, on Coventry Street, South Melbourne. And that building was acquired by the National Trust, and you can see it today. And now you see the same system being used in a two-storey warehouse in Geelong. Behind those wire screens, the same elegant curved cast iron windows, the same combination of wrought iron T sections with corrugated iron in between. The corner, though, because it's a two-storey building, a large cast iron angled section rather than a wrought iron one. And that building, which looks the same system almost exactly from the back and from the side, from the front was an elaborate shop warehouse building. Again, living quarters at the top and retail space below with large plate glass windows. And that survives today and has been partly restored. There it is visible today. Now that came from Glasgow. The makers of all those cottages were Robertson Lister of Glasgow, and they made everything from tiny cottages to large plate iron fronted mansions. Here's one of them. So this is now built as a warehouse, but not like the previous one. This has now solid plate iron front with windows in it. Looks like, if you see it in the flesh, it looks like a stone building. In fact, that's how it did look when I first saw it, because that warehouse was sent to Melbourne and then sold to the New South Wales government for the New South Wales Legislative Council Chamber, which is what it is today. And that facade, when I first told people in Sydney that's an iron facade, they wouldn't believe me. They assumed this was somehow, brick and stucco on top. The curved top was changed to a pitch top. You can see the curve below it. Back in Glasgow, only one of these buildings was built, these plate iron buildings. It's now been demolished. You see it's a very large villa. But in Australia, others came out as well. This one was made for export to a land commission in the Western District, William Nairn Gray, who actually died, and it was sent by way of Geelong, the nearest port. And in the end, the person who imported it, the merchant who imported it, built it himself as his own house, and it became Kiriya Villa in Geelong. There it is again. All that is cast iron, and all of it was made in Glasgow except the square porch, which was added to it. The curved elements were all made in Glasgow. And again, you would not looking at this building think it was iron, but every element is iron, including the most elaborately decorated barge boards and so on. Inside it, it's been hard to make out this side because it has inside a timber frame which carried lard and plaster, and those stripes are where the plaster came onto the timber. But if you ignore the timber, look behind it, you've got iron trays with flanges running inwards, bolted together. They often would be ground to make a perfect joint, or run with red lead. So from the outside, you can barely see the line of the joint. And there's a stanchion, a sort of column, on the back of this house. Now, I said to you, the building next door looks like masonry. Only two faces are made in plate iron. The back two faces you don't see were made in corrugated iron. And on the system here, where the column is shaped to take the corrugations, not curved like the Bell House patent, but with a groove to take the corrugated iron running into it. And this person here now makes a different form and tie. Samuel Hay was perhaps the biggest maker of buildings in Britain for export to Australia. But his buildings were not iron framed, they were largely timber framed, clad in corrugated iron. But he made what amounted to a whole village, perhaps in a week, packed it all up and sent it off then as a new village, beginning at first with humble cottages, later on adding stores and churches and so on. So there's a church, and that church came out to Melbourne. There's the interior. And there's one of the three churches he sent to Melbourne that's been demolished now in Port Melbourne. There's one that survives, just a fragment of it. Became a knitting mills and other things, but that behind that wall is the original church structure at Gisborne, Victoria. There's a complete one in Sydney, again now demolished. Cottages, quite elaborate cottages. And there's a minor cottage, and two of these survived in North Melbourne into the 20th century when they were declared slums. Those are 1930s views of cottages of that model used in North Melbourne. Rather high grade with these ones. This was a terrace of 4 houses exported by Hemming to Melbourne. They actually built as 2 pairs rather than a continuous terrace of 4. And 2 of them are now clad in brick. But you can see 2 of them left, these ones here. And the structure inside is rather odd. It has crisscross bracing and a sort of tie rod where the 2 is marked. There's a tie rod being pulled upwards, tensions across to hold the building together. And then grandest of all was this house here, which is again still corrugated iron on timber frame, but with a cast iron parapet. And it was built in New South Wales as the house Windsor Carriby at Bowral. That is there. Now, a couple of major works of interest. This is the old Royal Mint in Sydney. The structures were built in the colonial period, but within them, or behind the structure, the main mint buildings, were built these stone buildings in the 1850s, which have an iron frame and iron roofing inside them. Complicated iron roofs, particularly the top one with that curved element in it, which looks like a French truss. I don't know why it's being used here, because this was designed by the Royal Engineers. The Royal Engineers were responsible for the mint process. This mint, of course, is where they made coins. And so there's a minting works. In effect, a factory for making coins in Sydney. They had 3 different roofing systems, of which those are 2. And this one, which you have an iron grid, and those are panels of slate dropped into the grid. And you see at the right-hand side, it's trussed up. Those iron rods are supporting this frame in tension. And here's a complete system in the basement of that building, or ground level of that building, with cast iron girders on octagonal columns. Does it look familiar to you? You've seen something like this before, haven't you? Look familiar? Never seen anything like this before? Sure. Crystal Palace. Very similar system to the Crystal Palace, obviously copied from it. There's the Crystal Palace system where the girders are being dropped onto the columns. There's a comparison. Crystal Palace and the Royal Mint in Sydney, just a difference in scale. And then this wonderful industrial building, which was found in Waterloo in Sydney and packed away in the 1990s and finally been re-erected. A mysterious structure, nothing much was known about it, but made by H&MD Grizel in London, Henry and Matthew Grizel, whose mark appears on the columns. And it had most elaborate trusses. They're the Polonceau form truss with, see that strange flared ornamental scroll element, which is characteristic of these trusses as used in Britain, there, called the lily flower. And there they are, original ones and the remade ones, when it was being rebuilt. And there it is, the central frame as rebuilt in Sydney today. Now, we now know almost certainly that it was built as a replacement for the Kent Brewery, which had been burnt down and imported in the mid-1850s. And then finally, I think, Francis Morton of Liverpool, who made elaborate decorative cottages and corrugated iron. But the point about Morton is he made not only these decorative cottages, but he made iron telegraph poles, mostly for India rather than Australia. And they're made in 2 halves and then bolted together, or later on riveted together down the side flange. Now, they're very characteristic form. So when you see a shape like that, you think that might be made by Francis Morton, Liverpool. So when you see this post holding up a rubbish bin in Queensland, would that be a Francis Morton column as a result? Same as the telegraph poles? You might think I'm fantasizing when I suggest that, but when you look at the top of that post, little post, read around, you can't read the lettering clearly, but the lettering around the top says Francis Morton. So this tiny little rubbish bin post in Queensland is made by the same Liverpool man who made the whole of the telegraph system in India. And the reason this happened is that he advertised, his agent in Australia, Charles Dibbley, advertised that they could supply buildings and iron components anywhere within 30 miles of a railhead without extra cost. So a railhead being the railways in Queensland ran inwards from the coast. There was at first no north-south line. But you could get to a port, you could take the goods inland and ship them from a railhead within 30 miles, you'd pay no extra cost for your building. So these elements were particularly taken up in Queensland, where you get things like this fence at the Ravenswood Cemetery, all made by Francis Morton. Now, I don't think I'll go on to Frederick Brae because I think we're running out of time, but I'll just show you quickly the cable station at Broome in Western Australia, which is made by Graby of London. And that's where I'll leave it. Okay, thank you.